Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinaks was in Ottawa on Thursday to attend a House of Commons committee studying the First Nations Clean Water Act. At a press conference following the committee, Woodhouse Nepinaks said the Assembly of First Nations fully supports the legislation. The National Chief was also asked about next week's Special Chiefs Assembly in Calgary, where chiefs are being asked to support the $47.8 billion final settlement agreement on child welfare reform. APTN News asked her to respond to the Chilcotin Nation's ask for First Nations to vote against the settlement so that a revised process can be put in place.
I know that there's lots of issues to work through on it, and I know that, of course, there's always wanting to be maybe a little bit of a pause because we kind of wonder, is this going to be okay? But I look forward to the discussion next week with Chiefs and Assembly. We're all coming together next week. There's a high number that have already registered because everybody's so passionate about it. So you will hear passionate voices next week because it's about something so precious that it's our children.
And we will speak with the National Chief at length about next week's meeting on tomorrow's newscast. The Minister of Indigenous Services was also among those appearing before other politicians looking at First Nations drinking water. The First Nations Clean Water Act has been before the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs for months now. The ongoing hearings come at a time when the Shamattawa First Nation and federal government are sitting in court over a failure to provide clean drinking water to the nation in northern Manitoba. 145 long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted since the Liberals formed government in 2015. However, 33 still remain.
Listen, right now, Canada can arbitrarily decide how much they want to fund a particular water system. Canada can arbitrarily decide that they're going to cut the funding for water operators across this country. Canada can arbitrarily decide, what regulations might be in place. And what First Nations are saying through this legislation is, first of all, respect our self-determination. Second of all, be a true partner. And that's what this legislation actually achieves. Of course, there are opportunities for amendments to make it stronger. You will deliberate on those amendments. I will look forward to your feedback. As I've said publicly, we are open to amendments that strengthen the aim of this bill. But this bill has really two goals. One is to ensure that First Nations never, ever are in the position that they were before 2015, where they were at the whim of a federal government that did not prioritize their rights to clean drinking water. And two, set a framework where First Nations have the tools they need for full self-determination over protecting their water sources and their water systems.
And we'll have more on this later in the show with the panel as well. Well, First Nations children living on reserve in Manitoba are now eligible for children's disability services and home care after a 14-year-long legal battle. Sav Jones has that story.
In 2010, Harriet Sumner Pruden and her son, Dewey, sought to make change through a complaint to the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, or MHRC. Dewey, who was only 8 years old at the time, needed access to provincial disability-related services like home care and physiotherapy. But because he lived on their reserve of Penamutang First Nation, Dewey was often denied or delayed that help by the Manitoba government. In 2014, Harriet said she knew they weren't alone in their struggle with discrimination.
It's still a long battle, but I'm hoping within his lifetime, things change.
Now, after 14 years of determination, those eligibility restrictions have finally come to an end, thanks to a settlement agreement between the Manitoba government, the MHRC, and Dewey's family. It comes with two main commitments from the province: to expand children's disability services and home care eligibility to First Nations children living on reserve, and to create a working group with federal and First Nations governments to see how those services can be best delivered. Harriet says she feels relieved that what she set out to fix has now been resolved and looks forward to the working group's findings.
I don't have any concerns at all because I know it includes our First Nations and also with both federal and provincial governments. So
we're at a time where the topic of reconciliation is on the table, and I hope, it moves forward in a positive way.
The Manitoba Human Rights Commission's Executive Director, Karen Sharma, says that dialogue is necessary to address the disparity in services First Nations communities face.
And we think that's an important component as well, because of course we want to make sure that First Nations children living in Manitoba have access to the supports that they're entitled to, but we need to go a step further to improve the supports that are out there and also better align those supports with the right to self-determination. There's a commitment for that to be taking place over the coming couple of years, and a requirement that reporting occur to our commission. We'll be sort of monitoring that taking place every 6 months, so that we can see that there's been real progress toward that commitment to really ensure that the services and supports that are needed for First Nations children are happening in Manitoba.
Now, little Dewey is an adult, 22 years old, and will no longer directly benefit from the change. Still living in Penamutang, Harriet says her son continues to have difficulties in accessing services near their community, roughly 220 kilometers north of Winnipeg.
They don't have the same resources, as any other, with home care, I'd have to look deeper into that, I guess, because, we do have limited resources in our communities, our First Nation communities.
She says Dewey signing the settlement agreement reminded them of their ancestor, former Penamutang Chief Richard Woodhouse, who was a signatory of Treaty 2.
I always hear that echoing in my mind, them speaking to me and saying, be resilient and keep moving forward.
Harriet says she is thankful to the Public Interest Law Centre and MHRC for their continued support all these years. Sav Jonesa, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
It has been 13 years since Tanya Nepinaks from the Pine Creek First Nation went missing in Winnipeg. Her family has never stopped fighting for justice, and today on her birthday, Nepinaks' family and a community of supporters held a walk and feast in Winnipeg to honor her life and demand action for MMIWG2S. Reporter Sierra Bettens brings you to the walk.
On what would have been her 45th birthday, dozens gathered to honor Tanya Nepinaks, who went missing 13 years ago. In downtown Winnipeg, calls to search for Nepinaks are spray painted on sidewalks. Marchers wore red to honor all missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. Her aunt, Sue Caribou, handed out Justice for Tanya shirts created in her honor.
I have a lot of mixed feelings today. I'm overwhelmed because it's been a long time since we celebrated Tanya's birthday, and today is so emotional for me.
Nepinaks was a member of the Pine Creek First Nation in northwestern Manitoba. She was last seen on September 13th, 2011. The then 31-year-old left her home on Sherbrooke Street to walk to a pizza place around the block and was never seen again. In June 2012, Sean Lamb was charged with second-degree murder in connection to Nepinaks' disappearance, but those charges were later stayed. At the Thursday walk, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Acting Grand Chief Betsy Kennedy, remembered attending the first march held for Nepinaks over a decade ago.
And I was with family when they went to the Brady landfill a number of years ago. So that's the reason why I'm here today, is to provide and let the family know that I still think about her all the time.
As the community came together to sing happy birthday and offer medicines to Nepinaks' family, her aunt voiced her demands for justice.
Most of our missing and murdered are probably at these landfills, just like the unmarked graves. So I think they should search all the landfills and consider the landfills as a crime scene. and stop putting trash on our loved ones. They're not trash.
Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Well, as mentioned, the First Nations fight for clean drinking water isn't only happening in the halls of Parliament. It was the focus of court proceedings this week, and it's also the focus of our Truth in Politics panel coming up after the break. Welcome back. The Shamattawa Cree Nation in northern Manitoba is the lead plaintiff in a class action suit against the federal government. Whether or not Canada is obligated to provide these communities with clean water is at the heart of the matter. Lawyers for the Crown say these communities should help themselves. For more on this, our Truth and Politics panel is here. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press, and Jennifer Lewitz is a partner at Pasqua Harbor Strategies. Nigan, Jennifer, thanks for being here. Jennifer, we'll start with you. This case was argued this week in federal court. It's about the right to clean water. The First Nations in the class action don't have clean water, and in some cases haven't for some time. Why, in spite of all the pretty words of reconciliation on the part of this government, is this case before the courts?
I think you just brought up an excellent point. The words around reconciliation, it seems to be a lot of words. And, you know, we've been looking at the history of this Liberal government over the last 9 years, and it's just becoming very, very disheartening, the amount of time that First Nations people in this country need to spend in court fighting for rights. And, you know, the amount of money that's being spent as well. It just seems like a repetitive cycle with every government that we've had, that in order to uphold any rights, it has to go to court. And I saw the news article title that said, you know, we don't really have an obligation to provide clean water. Yeah, but I would argue against that, because if the country is actively playing a role in dismantling the rights of Indigenous people and attacking our waterways and stuff like that, where does the right thing to do come into play here? And I think that this is just a prime example. This Liberal government spent more on fighting First Nations in court than their predecessor, the Harper government. So this is a problem, and I think it's absolutely disheartening.
Nigan, outside of the court, how would you say that the lack of clean water affects people in First Nations? How does a boil water advisory affect the people in the communities?
Just to add to one thing to what Jennifer just said, it's preposterous, the government's argument that there isn't an obligation. I mean, the reality is the government created this problem. Well, subsequent federal governments created this problem, so they have an obligation to fix it. Living in a First Nation with a boil water advisory, and I myself have not, but my relatives have, and having been there and visited, spent time, I certainly don't pretend to know what that's like to be under a boil water advisory for 24/7, but I can tell you this, that the amount of desperation that's created when you don't have water, which are basic things like washing, cooking food, just simply being able to have the peace of mind of knowing that you can go and at any time wash your hands or get a drink, or the absolute way in which water is related deeply with trauma is a reality in First Nations. So how does it affect you? It affects everything. It affects your parenting. It affects the ways in which you go to work. It affects the way in which you wake up in the morning. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and doing what Canadians are privileged to do every single moment of their lives, and nobody ever questions, and absolutely nobody would ever interrupt, which is to get a drink of water in the middle of the night. Just go down to your faucet and then be able to get some sustenance when you're at your driest point. So all of that has to say that it is indicative of the federal government's continuing disheartening treatment of First Nations, and the fact that this preposterous argument, this heartless argument, is being forced upon First Nations while ministers come out and say, oh no, we're going to be dealing with boil water advisories. The Trudeau government has dealt with a number of boil water advisories, about 2/3. But there still is 60 to 70, and increasingly every single year. 2 were solved this year. 6 rose as a result of the problem of infrastructure. And the fact is that this is something that just about treating people like human beings that this is all about.
Yeah, it reminds me of when Winnipeg had to do that boil water advisory for like maybe a couple of days, and Shoal Lake 40 was still without water. Jennifer, Canada's argument, you touched on it, is that they have no legal duty to provide clean drinking water, and that nothing is preventing a community like Shamattawa from helping itself. What do you make of that argument?
I think that's a really lazy argument. I think, we've seen over the last how many years, even beyond our time, where there are constant decisions being made that affect the sovereignty and well-being of First Nations. And then at the end of the day, it's, well, why don't you help yourself? And why do we need to help you? But there's been constant, since it predates Canada's existence, that there's been decisions made from people that are not First Nations that affect First Nations, including, multiple government policies and the Indian Act. And then they come in and say, well, why don't you just help yourself? Well, why should nations be on the hook for coming up with dollars from whatever various areas to fix a mess that essentially at the end of the day is at the feet of the federal government? And access to clean drinking water should not be a controversial issue. And further to Egon's point about, them lifting the long-term water advisories, that's another issue right there. Is we read the Auditor General's report, and it highlights that the federal government is putting interim and non-sustainable solutions. And just because a long-term water advisory has been lifted doesn't mean it's not susceptible to being in short-term. And if they continue to underfund water treatment plant operators on nation, again, it's just setting nations up to fail. And it's like, here, sorry about all of the very, very oppressive government policies over the last 100+ years. Now figure it out and fix it for yourself. No, I think that's completely unacceptable. And I think this paints a very important picture that despite the words that are said, it is not reconciliation.
And Egon, quickly here, whether Canada has a legal duty or not to provide First Nations with safe drinking water is now in the hands of a judge. That judge is Justice Paul Favel from the Poundmaker Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, who grew up himself without clean drinking water at times. Do you think that might have any impact on this case?
Well, I think that Canadian judges all the time have contradictions that they deal with. Many of them have investments in companies they have to make decisions upon. Canadians have to operate in laws and societies that oftentimes are racism. They belong to political parties. I mean, the fact is judges are dealing with kind of situations of objectivity like this all the time. I don't envy Paul Favel, and I don't envy the position that he's been put in, but I also am very reminded that all of us as Indigenous peoples who are in institutions all across this country have to constantly balance our own traditional values and then engaging the very laws and principles, institutions, ideas, attitudes within our workplaces all the time. So I don't envy Paul Favel for having been put in this situation, and I also certainly feel a great deal of empathy for what he is going to have to navigate, which are racist laws, racist arguments, thoroughly divisive, clearly a Jekyll and Hyde approach by this federal government. But I also say this is what it's like to be an Indigenous person in an institution and a professional.
Egon, Jen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, me much.
And a reminder, you can catch up on any of our Truth in Politics panels that you may have missed by visiting our APTN News YouTube page. Still to come tonight, a preview of this evening's Nation to Nation. Stick around. Back. Time now for our photo of the day. And it wasn't just Manitoba that was enjoying the Northern Lights this week. They were also highly visible in Temagami, Ontario. Thanks to David Bauer for capturing this view on a beautiful evening. And thanks to his friend Mike for sending it in. Thanks to all of our viewers for sending in pictures this week. If you have a photo you'd like to share, send it to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, showers and 12 for Fredericton, Charlottetown, and St. John's. Cloudy and 9 in Kuujjuaq, rain and 6 in Nain. 18 in Montreal, showers and 15 in Val-d'Or. 23 with rain in Sault Ste. Marie, showers and 18 in North Bay. 18 with rain in Thunder Bay, showers and 14 in Sioux Lookout. 11 in Puckatawagan and God's Lake, sunny and 13 in Norway House. 15 with showers in Winnipeg, sunny and 16 in Brandon. 15 in Regina and Saskatoon. 12 with rain in Meadow Lake and La Ronge. In northern Alberta, 10 in High Level, 9 in Fort Chipewyan. 14 with rain in Edmonton, 20 in Lethbridge. 14 in Vancouver, sun's out in 17 in Kamloops. 11 with rain in Prince George, smoky and 9 in Fort Nelson. 0 in Old Crow, 6 in Whitehorse. 6 in Yellowknife, 4 in Norman Wells. Snow and 0 in Sax Harbor, +1 in Polituck. 3 above with snow in Chesterfield, snow and 2 above in Whale Cove. Flurries and 0 in Resolute, snow and 2 in Arctic Bay. Over to our Ottawa studio now, where Fraser Needham is standing by with a look at tonight's Nation to Nation.
Coming up after the news, Brian Francis recently raised the issue of government funding cuts to Residential Schools Documents Advisory Committee in the Senate. The lack of funding greatly affects how organizations like the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation can access these documents. I'll also speak to Madeleine Redfern, who is part of the newly formed Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice, which seeks to provide services to Indigenous women who are victims of forced or coerced sterilization. John Howard Society lawyer Pierre Hawkins also drops by the Ottawa studio to talk about a court case that aims to increase the rights of inmates in the Saskatchewan correctional system. All this ahead on Nation to Nation.
Thanks, Fraser. APTN Investigates returns this week with an all-new episode. Investigative journalist Brittany Guillot looks into the mystery surrounding the death of Charles Odie. Odie's body was found wedged in a Vancouver storm drain in 2015. Authorities declared his death an accident, but his family has never stopped searching for answers. Here's a preview.
It's been more than 9 years since Charles Odie passed away, and it's the first time Eugenia has been back to the site where her son's remains were found. A gentle gust of wind rolls through the neighborhood, and Eugenia feels his presence.
I feel kind of like I keep thinking about that day, that evening when they first brought me here to the site, and it's just a lot of memories are flooding back.
The police say no one was ever considered a suspect in his death. The Odie family doesn't believe the police theory.
Like, didn't you see his body and his marks on his body? Like, it looked like my brother got beat up. It doesn't look like he fell in a drain and just, like, died.
The questions surrounding his death still play over in Eugenia's mind. If Charles didn't drown, then what really happened to him?
Looks good. Brittany will be here tomorrow to talk more about the show. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward, Marcy McGuitch. Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned. Nation to Nation is up next. Have a great night.